ranked number 5 in the world in 2019. And he's also leading the design of the next NSF flagship supercomputer, which will be deployed in Austin and become operational in 2026. Dan also graciously agreed to tell us about his vision for HPC and kindly offered to take us on a visit with us this afternoon. So let's
Thanks very much. Appreciate the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I perused, sat through Luciano's talk this morning, and I perused a bunch of the other talks. And, based on looking at them all last night, this talk has no equations. So we'll give you a short break from that during the course of the day. So also I would have gotten them wrong. It's been a while since I've had to write an integral equation out. So so I don't promise to actually follow the outline of the abstract I gave Luciano a couple months ago. So there we go. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about TACC, but I hope most of you are coming up this afternoon. I'll see you there. So I won't dive too deeply into some of the specs on some of the machines because we're actually going to walk you around them. And I think you've been using some of them during the course of the week here. So we'll show you what the actual hardware looks like and what's going to happen. But I do want to talk a little bit about what's coming up in high performance computing, what sort of the big trends are, and what does that possibly mean for you in terms of your research and your code. I'm wondering, sitting in the trapdoor already on the panel here. So, and then there's a couple questions for things I might learn from you. So yes, and black slides mean you need less slides. Sorry. And I also was a heathen and didn't do my slides in LaTeX. I apologize. So, so yeah, you will see both of these machines this afternoon. That's Stampede 2, which is sort of our big capacity machine. That's Frontera that I think you've been using that we'll take a walk through as well. That was number 5 in the world, but that was 2019 and time moves fast in these things, but it's still the best at certain problems of any machine in the world. So, and then we're designing this leadership class computing facility, which is our next generation machine. And I'm not going to talk too much about the hardware, but you'll be able to perhaps infer what's going to happen from some of the things I say about what's going on in the marketplace and in technology at the moment. So, which are two things that fight each other. So just a little about TACC for the first 5 or 10 minutes, and I know we're running late, so I'll try and make up a little bit of time here. But we have about 170 people. We don't do any sort of corporate IT, administrative systems. I just don't care. We don't do the payroll. We don't do any of that. We're 100% research computing, right? That's the only thing we do. That's all that we focus on. What you're going to see this afternoon represents about $150 million of investment in computing hardware, all of which gets old at exactly the same rate as your laptop, right? So if you're really irritated at your laptop once it's 4 years old and you want a new one, it's a much more annoying problem when you spend $150 million on stuff. We also have I write a lot of grants. Anyway, so it's my real job. But we've got about $100 million investment in physical plant to support the data centers. We have almost 10 million watts of capacity. When the LCCF is done with the new facility, we'll have a total of about 25 million watts of capacity. So, which is a lot when you start to think about sustainability. We're about 80% supported by the National Science Foundation and other federal agencies. We're about 10% supported by here at UT Austin. So we really see ourselves as sort of a national lab type research facility for this kind of thing. So, and yeah, that's, what's on the floor now. Over the next couple of years through the LCCF, we will have done about $2 billion in external funding over the course of our existence to make all this happen. So, and we have a commitment from the NSF to be a large scale facility through about 2036. So a long time. So, and we support a whole lot of research, but when you get to use our tools in this workshop and in other places in your research, and I know a bunch of our large users are here. Luciano's team is always one of our biggest users. Steve Louie's team, I think some of his folks are here, are always some of our biggest users. Friends at Binghamton, big users. So yeah, so we have lots of users around, but you're using things that there's been an enormous investment in to make sure that you get to do this kind of stuff and that we can really do this stuff at cutting edge. So, fundamentally, we provide the researchers, again, around the country. We have order of 50,000 users grand total with the computing, obviously the hardware, the data, the AI, and the software capabilities to support their research, and hopefully the expert help to use it. So And the ways people want to consume that is changing. And I want to ask you guys some questions about that. And just our annual update, last year, 2021, despite, dealing with working from home and all the supply chain nonsense. And by the way, supply chain means any server chip I want to get that costs like $1,000 a chip is easy. But then when you want to get the little firmware controller for the power supply, that's 50 cents. Those are like impossible. But still, despite all that, we did about 10 million jobs for almost 50,000 people last year. We delivered about 7 billion core hours while swapping out some of the systems. We were on the Gordon Bell Prize papers, the biggest computation of the year, and things like that. We had 3 sort of notable covers, 2 covers of science from stuff that we do. And of course, the highlights I'm going to give are the Nature and Science papers. But the vast majority don't turn into, same year we get a cover of science as the work gets done. Most of it is probably often more impactful, but equally impactful, but sort of incremental progress that happens over years. And in fact, we see that the curve on most publications goes up from work we do like 8 years after the work is done. So in terms of citations of it. So if you didn't get the cover of science from something you ran 2 months ago, you should not be discouraged. So that is the exception, not the rule, but it makes for good slides for funding agencies. So that was one in sort of a desalination problem, water transport through a membrane. The dousing the stratosphere one was Lior's large-scale pre-tornadic thunderstorm simulation and convection. But we do all sorts of fields of science. Although really, if you want to get down to it, there's really 2 kinds of things that we do. One is run big simulations with partial differential equations and sort of the kind of models that you're used to. And the other is AI, which is the same thing with statistical models in essence. So there's a much longer explanation of that, but nuts and bolts, that's really what it is. So, but we did some really big California earthquake simulations. So if you live in California and you want to make sure you're going to stay attached to the United States, or maybe not, if you prefer, we did a lot of work around that with some folks at SCEC, the Southern California Earthquake Center, and Columbia. We did a lot of, this is more of a high throughput computing problem where it's a lot of little runs for data analysis. But this is for the IceCube instrument, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where they took basically a cubic kilometer of ice and turned it into a big neutrino observatory. You get these sort of neutrino, anti-neutrino interactions. And last year, from some of the data analysis they ran on our systems, they actually announced the detection of glacial resonance, which again, like many things that we do, the theory was 60 years old. And the observation happened last year. We were a big part of the LIGO colliding black holes observation, right? Which again, Einstein had predicted in 1915. We did the detection in 2015, 100 years later. It's interesting how a lot of those happen. We put about, I think 20 million CPU hours into the Event Horizon telescope that was just announced a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times of the imaging of the black hole at the center of the Milky Way. Again, there's no actual picture there, right? It's 8 different telescopes around the world. It's a massive amount of data processing that comes up with those images that you see. And we were a part of that. Almost any big computational problem we're around somewhere, but we also do, outside of the big collaborations, lots of single investigator stuff. I thought this one was particularly cool. This was a researcher, Ying Li, at the University of Connecticut. And this is about nanoworms for doing drug delivery, right? So, chemotherapy type drugs, really toxic stuff that we inject in you to try and kill the tumor slightly before we kill you. And so the idea is to deliver it directly to the tumor. And they've traditional sort of nanomedicine delivery for that is using the little balls that you see in the imagery there. Yes, for people online, right? This is the sort of traditional shape, and these get stuck either between the red blood cells or sort of going into small capillaries around the curve there, and the flow doesn't work. So they've looked at doing these sort of nanoworm things, these crazy little shapes here, that can sort of literally wiggle their way through, and they make better turns, and it gets a higher percentage of the medicine delivered to the tumor. Turns out the way they're doing it, it's also magnetic, so you can guide them in with magnetic fields. And so more of the poison that's being injected into you makes it to the tumor, and less is sort of left in other parts of your body, which makes you so ill from that. So, so there's, computational applications abound in just all sorts of things. And increasingly, we're seeing, again, the integration of the sort of statistical models, AI models with traditional, equation-based simulation models, so, or PDE models. So in this case, this is Tiziano's work at Carnegie Mellon and Yin Lee at Flatiron. And in this case, they're doing sort of, and they've been running on 100,000 cores pretty well continuously, and checkpointed 2-day increments for like 6 months this year. So they have a job running now on Frontera that's eating about 25% of the machine. But in this case, they're sort of doing whole universe simulations, but they're using sort of they've trained a neural net to sort of interpolate from lower res images of parts of, groups of galaxies to the detail that you get at higher res. And so, and once they can sort of do that interpolation, they can reduce the amount of data that goes in the front end of their simulation. So they boosted their computational efficiency by about a factor of 500. That came out in Proceedings of the National Academy last year. So again, all sorts of stuff. This is a more materials problem, a little closer to where you are, looking at solar cells, and they're using support vector machines. Not all of AI is these deep learning massive networks, although the cloud guys and the people who sell chips for them would prefer that you think so. But in this case, using support vector machines to reduce the amount of annealing that they have to do when looking across a range of materials. Really, same set of materials, but across a range of processes for how much you heat it up and cool it down in the solar cell process. So we do a whole bunch of that, and that's really what we're here to do, right? To enable these large-scale discoveries through various advanced computing, and that's Lee's work again. 200,000 cores went into that. And actually, we have 20 teams that have crossed the 200,000 core threshold for individual runs, and we have about 10 that have crossed the 400,000 core threshold, and we don't have more than 500,000 cores so on any one machine. So that's what's sort of limiting it, although the new number one machine is about 8 million simultaneous threads, so or 8 million cores. So unfortunately, these numbers went down a little bit because we just updated the top 500 list at the International Supercomputing Meeting, which was in Hamburg 2 weeks ago. I was over there for that. So Frontera is now slightly over 3 years old. It's the 6th time it's been ranked on the top 500 list. It's every May and November that it gets updated. So we're down to 16th, but we're still the largest sort of general purpose machine in the world. So without having to resort to accelerators to get to that performance. I think Stampede 2 is now down around 40, but again, that's another one of our big NSF systems. We just added the new Lone Star system. We have an AI system called Longhorn that's actually going to get incorporated into Lone Star. We have cloud testbed systems. We have various classes of storage systems, depending on whether you want to archive data or publish data or have data go really fast. But all together, and you'll see most of it this afternoon, there's actually some in different buildings, but we have about 75 petaflops, 16,000 physical servers, and a third of an exabyte of data at this point spinning. So this is the newest one that you'll see, which is one of our water cooled, liquid cooled. It's fully immersed in mineral oil. Before we put the wrap on it, these were all white. Just referred to them as the space coffins. But the earlier version, you could see it bubbling, and those were the chicken fryers. But we have 400 servers in those tanks that you'll see where we run them just literally completely immersed in liquid to make things work. So with that, and like most things, we occasionally have to stop and think because it's getting hard to stay on these sort of Moore's law equals performance curves. Moore's law is actually about density of transistors per square centimeter, but and that curve is fine, but the performance curve associated with it has gone down. But we really have made ridiculous amounts of progress in a fairly short time. There's been sort of long-term studies of performance, and about a third is architecture, about a third is algorithms, little under a third in both those cases. The largest single term is physics, right? That drives this forward, right? The ability to make better semiconductor processes have driven us from our sort of, this is in teraflops, so our sort of half teraflop systems of the early 2000s to the 40,000 teraflop systems we were able to deploy in 2019. So there aren't many jobs where you see a factor of 80,000 inside of 20 years working. And actually my first system, first Beowulf Linux cluster I built. It's be 30 years next year. Yes, I'm old, so that's the corollary there. But our goal was to hit a gigaflop for $50,000. And so now we worry about exaflops, although my budget has gone up from like 50,000 to 100 million. So that does make it easier, but still, it's a ridiculous change over time. And so, and there's a whole lot of people, not me, who make that happen up at TACC, and you'll meet a few of them this afternoon. So with that as just a quick overview of the center, let's talk about sort of what's coming. And to see what's coming, it's sort of a weird interplay. I learned this from mentors a long time ago. Surprisingly, the basic science is actually fairly predictable around semiconductors, right? That we're going to make improvements. We don't necessarily know how, but that improvements are coming is something you can almost count on a semi-regular cadence. It speeds up, it slows down, but it keeps happening. What happens in the product space is fairly convulsive because there's market forces and general craziness and semi-monopolistic practices that are sort of interfering with all that stuff. So that translation of we can make better devices on the physics side to we can actually buy better systems is often a seriously nonlinear type process. So I want to talk about trends in technology, but also trends in the marketplace of technology, and because that really affects what we're going to do, because there's the theoretical best thing to do, and then there's I have this much money and this will cut me a deal, which makes a huge difference. And then there's trends in how folks like you want to consume that technology, which should inform, the way that we build systems. So we'll talk about all of that. So first, technology, sort of things that are going on, sort of the dominant things we worry about, power, parallelism, the rise of the sort of streaming core model with GPU, the end of the dominance of x86, and things. I think I actually forgot to put in IO slides because I was at 50 and I stopped. But yeah, what's going on with file systems is also pretty interesting. But so let's start by just talking about power for a couple of minutes. Power has been a sliding goal at a time when it's not politically popular to consume a huge amount of power. So if you read exascale papers, and again, a theme you'll see me go to is this is one of the rare fields of science where almost every paper from 15 years ago is wrong. Literature that's 4 years old is sort of out of date. So, there are seminal papers from the 60s and 70s that matter, but they're the vast minority of what gets published. So, but if you read everything about exascales, we were going to deliver it for 10 to 15 megawatts, was the prediction in 2011, and we hit an exaflop. We were also going to get there by 2018. In 2014, the goal to hit an exascale, 10 to the 2 to the 60th power machine was 20 megawatts. In 2022, we actually delivered, the first 2 exascale systems came up last year in China, but for various export control reasons that have nothing to do with technology, it has to do more with the US puts vendors that get big announcements in China immediately on the export list, which affects who they can do business with. So they just stopped admitting to it and ranking on the top 500 list in China. So really, we hit exascale last year, but the first documented machine is Frontier at Oak Ridge, and they stole my name. Frontera was originally going to be called Frontier, but they got into the federal budget a little before me, so we changed names. They claim like 22 megawatts. It's really, that's if you ignore file systems and data center overhead and stuff like that. It's in a 45 megawatt facility, but it's somewhere north of 25 megawatts when we actually delivered it. And even that was a pretty big breakthrough with AMD on power. And based on that, if you look at Livermore, Argonne, Oak Ridge, the big federal Department of Energy centers where they put the big machines, they're all expanding to 85 megawatts plus for the data center. If you drive over to Mansfield Dam, which holds up Lake Travis over here, don't know if you're going out that way while you're in town, but fairly large hydroelectric facility. The turbines are 30 megawatts. So more than that is the bottom line. And you might have noticed, having spent this week in Austin, where it's cool and rainy, as you probably enjoyed, we can't really run hydroelectric here anymore. So there's not enough water to run through the turbines. But similarly, you see this on the micro scale. If you talk to Intel and AMD, and NVIDIA for that matter. In sort of 2015, we were never going to break the 130 watt per chip barrier. That was the socket. That was what industry was willing to pay for. You know, they were just going to design in that envelope, and that was going to work. And NVIDIA was at 300 watts because GPUs would never be more than 300 watts, because even with external power connections and the power supplies, you can't put more than 300 watts on a PCI slot and make it work. So a PCI Gen 3 slot anyway. So that was, you know, that was the power envelope. Everybody could plan on it. That's what it was going to be. In the roadmaps I got 2 weeks ago, those numbers were 500 watts and 800 watts. Because as it turns out, you believe in the 130 watt limit until you're losing to a competitor, and then you immediately break it. So, and the only way we've been able to stay on this curve is, and again, all of this, like many things, is driven by physics, right? The process Intel's pushing, the gates on the transistors are 20 silicon atoms wide. And as we've gotten smaller and smaller, what's changed is not that our ability to build denser devices is still good, and they are lower power than previous devices, but the performance curve was capped by, as we've gotten smaller and smaller, the leakage current is beginning to become a dominant factor versus the power to actually operate them. So, to continue to get the improvements in performance that people expect, they're having to keep pushing the power and the power density up and up. And by the way, they're roughly the same size devices that are going to be, well, now we have up to 270s. So we've already doubled the 2015 limit for all time. 64K of RAM was also a good number. The famous paper, 1970s, never mind. Their density per square centimeter makes that sort of interesting. So in fact, that's the last bullet there, right? So as you think about these machines, the power keeps going up, right? We're figuring our next machine is going to be 13 or 14 megawatts. But this runs pretty counter to the concerns about sustainability right now. So for instance, in all the European data centers, the big EU machines, they're pushing for warm water, order 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 36, 37 Celsius water to be the cooling water. But if you have warm water, really, no matter how fast you pump it, if you have this much surface area, there's a limit to how much thermal energy we can take out of those chips. And they're almost at it, right? The next generation chips, we probably can't do warm water cooling on. And in fact, if you just to sort of extrapolate the curves, within about 4 years, which, I'm negotiating and designing our system for delivery 3 years from now. So 4 years is not a long way, right? So we may need phase changing, whatever you pump across the thing, we probably have to pump as a liquid and remove it as a gas, because you get that extra energy of making the matter change state, right? So to get the amount of cooling per square centimeter that we're going to need with these packages. And again, the GPUs, because they put them in bigger sockets, are more power. And by the way, there's a lot of argument about, are GPUs faster because they're architecturally superior to CPUs? I would point out, if you give twice as many transistors, twice the electricity budget, you're probably going to run faster, regardless of what the architecture is. So, GPUs use even more power. And on the bright side, after the last couple of weeks in the markets, we may not spend most of that on cryptocurrency anymore. So, which by comparison, right, we draw megawatts in HPC systems. Bitcoin mining is 110 terawatt hours a year. So terawatts, so truly ridiculous numbers. But so power and how we're going to physically cool that, can we actually build systems to physically cool it, is certainly a limit that we have. And then how we sort of balance the needs of sustainability, right? The corporate world, the cloud guys don't want to do this level of cooling. They buy most of the chips. So that's a balance that we have to take into account. Parallelism. So most of you deal with parallel codes at this point. Can't tell you how important that is. Let's just think about our system at the moment, Frontera, right? Our biggest one. It's 8,400 nodes, right? Which means 16,800 chips, give or take. I'm rounding a little bit here. I have the exact numbers, but people think I'm an even larger nerd than I actually am when I give them. So it's 8,368 nodes, but so that's roughly 450,000 cores. So that's 1 degree of expressing how much parallelism you have to actually really use the machine, as you have order 500,000 processing elements. But each one of those cores has 2 simultaneous floating point pipelines Each of those floating point pipelines can issue a fuse multiply add instruction. So really, super useful in vector math, right? But and everything, including deep learning, eventually ends up being small matrices. So multiply add is 2 instructions, 2 of those per cycle. So that's a factor of 4, and you can do them on a 512-bit operand, right? So if you're doing double precision in your code, that's 8 64-bit numbers. If you're doing single precision, it's 16 32 bits. And eventually machine learning will get to 1 bit or a guess, but they're doing a lot of 8-bit or 16-bit now. So it's, even more times that, right? So we're running those chips at 2.3 gigahertz, right? It actually varies on a millisecond basis as to what the actual frequency is, but let's just call it 2.3 gigahertz. So every 2.3 billionth of a second, to keep the machine full, if we were going to run at peak efficiency, I need 450,000 cores times 2 for the number of pipelines times 2 for the fuse multiply add times 8 for the double precision length of a vector. So, order 15 million-ish simultaneous operations that you have to give me that your code can do without dependencies. And I need that every 2.3 billionth of a second, right? So, when we talk about a 40 petaflop machine, it's a really big number, right? So, and again, twice that many if you're working in single precision, 16 times that. So, we need codes that can't do 8 things at once or 16 things at once. They have to be able to do 15 million things at once to run at this scale. And believe it or not, there are codes that get there, but there are a lot of codes that don't. And this is actually really a sort of radical change for software, because the core thing, this explosion of cores, is a fairly recent thing, right? And again, looking at Philippe Janio's references, right? Talked about some data from the 60s, talked about some stuff from 2009, right? You can't use any of that. So if we think about the history of software, and we've been writing scientific software, there was efforts in the 40s and 50s, really took off in the 60s when somebody wrote something called Fortran, for which we'll never forgive them. But as it's evolved, but even if you just go back to 1988, which is still, I realize, before many of you were born, which is depressing because I was out of high school. But at that point, the first 1 gigaflop machine in the world, right? This is an old slide. In 1988, had 8 processors. So when we talked about the theory of computer science for parallel programming 30-ish years ago, we were talking about, let's get to 8, right? So by 1998, we hit the first teraflop machine, ASCII Red, I believe, at Sandia. It was doing same sort of simulations you do, but we've gone from 8 processors to 1,000 processors to get there, right? It's not that the chips got 1,000 times faster in 10 years. We just used a lot more of them, right? When we hit a petaflop 10 years later, with the Cray XT5, it was 150,000 processors, right? So a factor of 150. And this is an older slide, so of course everything's wrong. We're going to hit an exaflop by 2018, missed by 3 years. 1 times 10 to the 7th processors, maybe 100 times that many threads. That actually turned out to be low. We hit more concurrency than that, right? So we've gone from a concurrency of 8 in 30 years to a concurrency of millions. And this puts a lot of stress on software in ways that you don't look at, right? So, and again, this was just, what happened was the Nard scaling, that feature scaling where power started really hitting us, started biting around 2005. So if you looked at the average number of cores in a supercomputer, it was still in the dozens in the year 2000, right? 20 years ago. And it's started doing this exponential curve up. And, oh, I thought I had a build in on that one. But yes, we're at, we hit 500,000 by 2019. We were at 90,000 for the fastest machine in the world in 2009. So the amount of concurrency that you have to put into your codes goes up like an order of magnitude every decade. And that may or may not be sustainable. So, and that's one of the things that's led towards, speaking of number of cores, if you look at the number 1 machine there, and I'm sorry it's small, but that first column is cores. And so for Frontier, the new number 1 in the world as of 2 weeks ago, and that means it's run LenPack. I think it's run anything else yet, but coming soon. 8,730,112 cores in that machine. Now these are GPU cores, they're a little different, but it's still a lot to hit 1 exaflop. And again, they're listing a little over 21 megawatts of power there. But the other trend to look at here is because of this sort of desperation for more performance and architectural tricks to get it, we've seen the rise of alternative architectures because we can get a little more efficiency. I mean, part of it is GPUs are bigger, GPUs, use more power, so they're obviously going to be faster. If we built a CPU in the same power envelope, it would also be a lot faster. But there are some advantages to the way they manage memory and streaming and how far you have to move bits across the chip and some things like that. So, but it comes at a cost to you, the programmer, right? GPUs are not necessarily the easiest thing to express your codes for, and some algorithms don't do well, particularly sort of sparse PDE type things. So, but if you look at the 10 biggest systems of the world, you can see what's winning, right? So that's, again, probably too small for you to see, but Frontier, HPE, AMD chips, AMD GPUs. Fugaku is sort of a special case. That's the one in Japan. But it's effectively CPUs with the same sort of high bandwidth memory that we put into GPUs. But they sort of screwed up the vector implementation. So it's got some interesting issues, but it's a Fujitsu vector ARM based chip. So, but that's the only non-GPU one in the top 10 there, right? Number 3 is another AMD GPU. That's the new Lumi system in Finland. But Euro funded, but used by a lot of people beyond Finland. They're too small to get the funding for that kind of thing. Then Summit, also at Oak Ridge, is an NVIDIA base. Sierra is NVIDIA. Taihu Light in China uses their own special accelerator. That's Sunway SW26010, but that's essentially a mini core GPU-like structure. Perlmutter is NVIDIA GPUs. Selene, NVIDIA GPUs. The Tianhe is, again, a custom Chinese accelerator, the Matrox accelerators that still has some Intel chips, but that's just to run sort of move memory out of the accelerators at this point. And then number 10 is another AMD-based accelerated machine with AMD GPUs. So 90% of those are accelerated, and the other one is sort of a quasi-hybrid. In fact, if you have a pure CPU code that actually wants memory, because one of the limits of that Fujitsu chip is you have very little RAM per core to fit it all into the HBM modules. The single fastest CPU machine in the world is still Frontera at 16. So for a lot of codes that aren't GPU friendly, even though we're 16th on the list, we're the fastest machine in the world to actually run science problems on them. So, that's sort of an interesting trend, and we buck that trend because we know how much work GPU programming is, and we know about 1/3 of our users aren't close. So, but the push is this direction, right? To express even more parallelism and to make it more complicated. And our options are limited because, like I said, a lot of what we do is not only limited by the technology and the physics, but what's actually happening in the marketplace, right? And ultimately, so I grew out of the sort of Beowulf cluster thing, which was the move to sort of open source Linux clusters instead of big custom silicon for supercomputers. We started at NASA Goddard in 1993 on that. Tom Sterling, who also was in Germany 2 weeks ago, and I saw he'll be here in 3 weeks for a talk. But Thomas, used to say that our job in Beowulf clustering is to be scum-sucking bottom feeders, was his actual words, because the idea is, the global superconductor processor spend, right, worldwide is a couple $100 billion, right? HPC it's about a $15 billion market, but it's maybe 15% of that is chip cost, right? So we consume $2 or $3 billion a year of a $200 billion a year chip market. In fact, all electronics, if you get out of mainstream CPUs and into embedded, it's pushing $1 trillion. But it's a huge market space. But to some extent, we need to let what's happening in the markets determine what we buy, rather than doing what TOE tries to do, which is drive the vendors in a particular direction, because that's pushing a very small rock up a very steep hill with some big rocks coming down at you. So this really just struck me the other day. I was looking at not one of your codes, it's another field, but a very well-known, largely adopted open source code. And I was trying to figure something out about it. So I just went and opened up the last port of documentation on it. And it says it supports, and this is also the problem of sustaining software, is that anything you put on the web 5 years later, it looks ridiculous, right? If you don't maintain it. But So every piece of software that you put out is just more to the mortgage of old work, legacy work that you have to do over time. But it said that code supported most of the large-scale supercomputers, including IBM Blue Jeans, SGI, Sun, and Cray. And I said, well, what all those things have in common is that they don't exist. There are no Blue Jeans left. SGI was folded into HP years ago, and all those products are dead. Sun was bought by Oracle, and it's no longer around, and Cray just merged into HP a couple of years ago. And like all big mergers, IBM buying Red Hat, et cetera, that just means it's just a matter of time until they screw it up and kill it all. So, you know, your 5-year-old documentation is all about machines that don't exist anymore, because we have a lot less vendor options than we did in this space, right? There used to be dozens of computer companies. And now for me, we have some problems with large government procurements around Lenovo, because they're based in China, which leaves me Dell and HP, right, is the whole space. Right. So, and in that space, it used to be when you built a big machine, you'd buy processors from Intel or AMD for about 10 years. You'd buy InfiniBand from Mellanox or QLogic. If you wanted an accelerator, you pretty much went to NVIDIA. And that was the world. And by the way, now there's dozens of new AI chips. None of them have any penetration in HPC. That's a longer discussion than we want to get into today. So I like to say we're in the Highlander battle now, right? In the end, there can be only one vendor. So because they're eating each other and they're buying up the ecosystem. So in the last 2 years, NVIDIA bought Mellanox. So InfiniBand is now a proprietary product of somebody who makes chips. And NVIDIA started making CPUs. The Grace ARM CPU will be shipping in quantity. I might have dev kits for them already, but we'll be shipping in quantity by the end of the year. And they're building systems. They're HGX, DGX supercomputers that are out there now. You can buy whole systems from them. So NVIDIA owns software, CPU, accelerator, network. They'll buy a file system company sometime soon. So, and systems. Intel bought QLogic, turned that fork of IB into OmniPath, successfully killed it, and spun it off as a new company called Cornelis that brought it back. But they're still pretty tightly coupled. So if you buy an Intel cluster, you buy the Cornelis interconnect instead of the Mellanox because pricing. So, and Intel just started making GPUs for HPC. 1 year they might actually deliver them, or 4 late, but and they've started making this thing called Deos, which is their file system replacement. So they own storage, processor, accelerator, interconnect, which makes it interesting to say, if you buy an AMD cluster, the new things at 1310 on the list, with these new AMD GPUs, they make CPUs and GPUs now. What interconnect do you put in it? Do you buy it from NVIDIA or Intel? Their 2 biggest competitors, right? And what pricing do you think you get when you negotiate that, right? So things I don't write down because then I get called by lawyers, but I've been called by more than one lawyer. So sometimes just to testify that people are doing stuff stupid, but you look at all 3 of them, they're using the legacy of Cray, the HP Slingshot interconnect, which now pretty much has only been deployed at scale with AMD chips. So the HP alignment is in the AMD ecosystem. So yes, curiously, HP seems to be only delivering AMD systems at large scale this year, which means for HP, Intel and NVIDIA are no longer a play, which leaves me Dell. So you see, I have very few paths through this when we look at future systems. So, and like I said, good luck buying InfiniBand for your AMD GPU cluster. They'll happily sell it to you. You'll pay list. Realistically, when I do one of these $100 million deals, right, I'm paying on a bad day. The joke is HPC stands for half price computing, right? But but if you do half price, you're really bad at this. So, you know, the last Cray I actually bought had a list price of 66 million and I paid 9, right? So if you lose your discounting power because you're doing something they want you to do, then you're screwed because nobody can pay full price, right? So, so it's really hard to buy, I want Intel CPUs, a Mellanox interconnect, and NVIDIA GPUs or AMD GPUs, even worse. You're gonna get horrible pricing on that, right? It's gonna cost 4 times as much as a comparable system. And the performance difference isn't gonna be 4 times. So it doesn't make sense for anyone in the end. So it's really kind of crappy place to be for innovation, which means we'd have to be saved by the cloud. So, and this is a friend of mine at University of Arizona put this together, Nirav Merchant out there. It says, when people go to the cloud, it's like, well, I'm going to get rid of my IT staff and all my IT problems and everything will be wonderful. And then you discover that cloud is somebody else's computers with all the same problem, right? And then you discover there's 3 of them that all work differently. And then you discover that when you go to one of them, and then what you want is a computer, and they say, well, here's the menu of 175 services that we offer in the cloud, which you just fired all your IT staff, by the way, who knew what these were when you went to the cloud. So it's like, do I want the API gateway or app stream or elastic transcoder? I don't even know what elastic transcoder is, but anyway, and that gives you, like, there's a Nirav teaches this course in sort of cyber infrastructure, mixed grad, undergrad. And he said, here's a fairly simple question you'd think you'd want to answer in the cloud, right? You have a 10 terabyte data set. It's sort of easily parallel. You can process data in gigabyte chunks. Processing a gigabyte takes an hour, produces 100 megabytes of output. You need a gigabyte of RAM to do that. You can split up the data. Here's the Amazon calculator. How much does this cost? The lowest answer he got was $16. The highest answer was $220,000. And the mode answer for our modern grad students is $10,000. And none of those are right. So if you like having in your budget an uncertainty of 5 orders of magnitude, it's definitely the place to go. And that's just for doing straight up running your own code stuff, right? If you start doing AI or the big data stuff, they have this very simple menu of software options that you can go through, right? And I'm sure you've all learned all of these tools, right, recently. So for doing stuff, it's just hopelessly confusing, even if you spend all your time on it. So I like to say that I did also steal the slide from Nirav, but going to the cloud for your HPC resources is a lot like going to IKEA for your birthday cake, and you end up with this. Happy birthday, IKEA, here's your cake, right? So if you put together IKEA furniture, you get this. You have eggs, you have flour, you have butter. It does not look like a cake. It's all the stuff that makes a cake, but it's really not a cake. And so that's sort of our cloud issue at the moment. So running out of time, let me speed up a bit. So that's sort of what's going on in the marketplace. At the same time, you guys want different stuff. And a lot of that is around modes of compute, around being able to do things on demand, having higher levels of abstraction. So, our normal model, which we suspend for the purposes of your summer workshop where you have a reservation and things go fast, but is that the world is batch. And the world is batch because I can get 99% utilization on these very expensive systems, and backfill when we have big jobs, and do all sorts of things that maximize utilization. Or I can lower that utilization of my government-funded, have to report to Congress on how we're using the public's money for $100 million systems. I could lower that utilization by like 30% and give you interactive speed, which everybody wants. And usually there's sort of people are just impatient. And that is to some degree true. You're used to the instant on world, hit a button, get an answer. But there's a lot in AI or even in simulation where you're exploring a large data set or doing interactive tuning where batch is just way too painful, right? Hyperparameter tuning in AI, you need to be able to turn the knobs and see what happens, right? And then we have real-time constraints, right? There's nothing more useless than a hurricane forecast that takes 5 days to run to give you 3 days of accuracy, right? So same thing, we have cases doing proton therapy for tumor-specific dosages, right? Basically, the patient's in the MRI machine, you want to give them a dose in an hour, right? We got to get an answer. We got to do it now. Real-time control of fusion reactions, where if the plasma hits the side, bad things happen. And that's for a very large definition of bad things, right? So we have a lot of things where we need to be able to turn things around. We have a lot of persistent services, right? With these web-based tools and online apps, we have to connect to that. So we have to re-architect around that. And we're seeing lots of good scientific things that are based on either, combinations of your traditional CI. So this was, start with 2 petabytes of data, this out of UCLA, for doing natural gas pipeline decisions. It was like a few million runs of a finite element method code. Reduce that to strain curves, use the strain curves to change a model. You eventually end up with 12 megabytes of data in a Jupyter notebook that you can interactively make decisions about how well you can bend a natural gas pipeline in certain types of soil with certain seismic risks, right? So similarly for building resonant frequencies, right? Put it in an interactive worksheet, see the viz, turn it off and on. There's a lot of HPC on the back end, but I can't batch queue this for 2 days, right? When somebody's turning these knobs. So this is a cloud publication one, but so let's get to the punchline. So what does sort of all of this mean for you when you're writing codes, right? Or modifying the community codes that you, most of you probably all work with, right? One, just jumping back some, make it really, really parallel. And you want to do IO well. I didn't really get into IO, but that's the most common somebody screwed up system performance mode, and we're going to ban them from the system for a while, is they accidentally opened, well, the record is somebody made 100 million files in a day. And I didn't think we could do 100 million files in a day. So that was impressive, but it was not good for everybody else's performance. So they were very small files. And they kept that up for 3 days and made 300 million files. So, and then we killed it. So, but when you think about doing things at parallel, it means instruction level, thread level, task level, thinking about where memory is around those. There are some best practices for this. This is the NVIDIA version, so keep in mind this is the marketing version. And you know, when they put words like proven, productive, portable, and performant, that usually means things that they aren't, right? If somebody tells you bothers to tell you this is a really good wall, you should worry that the building's about to collapse, right? Because you just assume it was a good wall, and if somebody has to point that out to you, it's a problem, right? So, so just assume all those words are wrong. But this is sort of the three models, and I'll distill it down a little on the last slide. For NVIDIA, it's Fortran 23, C++ 25 have these parallel transformers, concurrent loops, right? You know, we have actual language semantics to express parallelism now. The sort of middle one is you start sticking pragmas all through your code, and OpenMP, CUDA, OpenACC, well, OpenACC, OpenMP are the directive level. That's a lot of the thread level parallelism. Or if you really wanted to go ultra fast, you get into the assembly language type stuff, which is CUDA, you know, expressly doing mem copies and stuff like that. So, and NVIDIA is trying to say, this is the continuum of the world based on how much performance you want. It's like, this is how much pain your customer is willing to tolerate that you think you can get away with. So, but essentially, if you want to be ready for the future in your codes, use these new parallel constructs in C++, Fortran, and Python now. The new Python standard has it. Those will not be the most performant right now because you're relying on a lot of system tools to do things that you could probably do better by hand if you thought about it, but you may be willing to pay that price to not have to do it by hand. If you're not going to go to that mode, and most codes aren't ready to translate to that, or you don't want to rewrite a million lines that the 8 grad students before you wrote, so use directives for thread level parallelism. So OpenMP or CUDA or OpenACC. Use MPI for task level parallelism, right? Your distributed memory stuff. And then use one of those threading systems inside it. And then again, think about the physical layout of chips, right? So right now, if you're using an AMD CPU, you want 4 MPI tasks per chip because there are 4 physical chiplets, each of which have different access to memory and caches. And as soon as you start doing remote memory accesses, performance falls off a cliff. So, you know, 1 MPI task per GPU, they're trying to make that better. We automatically pin memory to sockets for you, but in other environments that may not happen. And then think about scale. The way people end up writing 100 million files in a day is they tune the code on their laptop so that it saves its state once every 12 hours and does a checkpoint. And then they run it on 100,000 cores on our machine. The worst case was we had one that was checkpointing every 200 milliseconds, right? Writing out its full state 5 times a second, just in case. 89% of the processing time was writing out the state in case it failed. So, there are good codes that can do this, but many don't. So you need to know where you are. These are like good codes. This is one from your field, electronic structure code, right? And this is number of nodes. And so the way we actually do this roofline plot, it's a fairly simple one, but the y equals x line here, I promised no equations. I didn't promise no graphs. So the y equals x line is memory bandwidth, right? So you'd be fetching more bytes than is actually available in the memory subsystems if you went to the left of that. So everything is going to land to the right of that curve. And then the horizontal axis is flops per node. The vertical axis is flops per node. The horizontal axis here is flops per byte, right? How many instructions you do per byte of memory that you need. So those R peak lines are the different instruction sets in an Intel chip, right? So scalar is you're doing no vectorization at all. SSE is the sort of 8 years ago, you know, two doubles long vectors. AVX2 was 256-bit, 4 vectors long. That's where AMD is now. And then AVX 512 is you do the 512-bit instructions. And, you know, not everything uses AVX 512. So when you start thinking about the peak of the chip, you know, if you don't use vectorization, the peak's much lower. But so here's a code that goes out to 2000 nodes and still gets a couple of teraflops per node, which is pretty impressive. It doesn't scale great. But at 50 nodes, you're getting 70% of the theoretical peak out of the chip. That's pretty awesome, since the average is below 1. Here's an awesome code. So, and this again is going out to about 100,000 cores. So we scaled it. I think this actually went out to all 8,000 nodes on the machine. It's like 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000. They're all in the exact same spot, which means whether it's good or bad, that code scales very well. But it's still about 40% of peak performance. It's between the SSE and AVX peaks. That's an awesome code. That's a seismic code. It's out of Germany, although the lead developer just moved to UC San Diego. So most codes look like this, where all the dots are at the origin in this particular one. So I think I have another one where we blow it up. Yes. And so that's the bottom peak line, the scalar one, if you had no vectorization. And you see that there actually does get off the origin, but it still gets worse as you scale it up. So, which is impressive given how bad you are to start with. The best way to get speed up, by the way, is to have really lousy one node performance, and then doubling it on 2 is much easier. But this is a new C++ templated parallelism code, and it's disastrous. So this one is well clustered, so it's built well, but it's still below 50 gigaflops per node on a 4 teraflop node. So there's a lot of crappy stuff out there. So with that, before I let you ask me questions, I'm going to ask you a couple. I'm still under an hour. So one thing that affects our future systems is we are seeing huge shifts in what languages people are using right now. So I want to know, first of all, language of choice. If you were working in your favorite programming language or the one that you use the most for your research, those are probably 2 different questions, I realize. Fortran, how many Fortran programmers do we have in here? And how many of you really like it? So half and then less. C++, how many C++ or C? Well, let's throw C in there too. C++, just a few. Yep, that's what I thought. So DOE's banking the farm on templated C++. I'm telling no future programmers. So Python, how many Python fans do we have? Okay, that added up to more than 1. So how many people work in Fortran but like Python better? Okay, that's the more than 1. Got it. So useful. So lots of interest in Python and making it performant. So if we can't do good Python on it, we shouldn't buy it. Is what that tells me. How many of you are putting some aspects of AI or machine learning into your codes at this point or your workflows? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, few. Yep. So that's rising. How many of you ever think about how you do I/O in any of your software? Yay! You are now all my favorite people. Just so you know. From that, how many of you ever work with something like Jupyter or Python notebooks or interactive Google Colab? Yep. How many of you like doing that better than working from batch and command line with that same set? Okay. You really are my favorite person because you also went for batch, right? It's like the manual transmission of computing. So it's command line. I'm still a command line person, I believe. If you can't do it in VI, why bother? And this one's a ratio one, but how much of your time do you spend on dealing with like code, data, and managing that? I'll ask like different thresholds here versus how much time you actually spend on the interesting parts of your research, science, and engineering. So how many of you spend more than a quarter of your time on sort of code and data, programming? Really low. Well, okay, and then you all admit it over time. So anybody more than half of your time, you think, on that stuff? Yep, still a few. Okay, all good to know. So yes, when the vendors say, just make this little change to your code, and I say, no, there are thousands of codes. Yes, because we get pushed to change the programming model a lot and we fight back. And this is more or less why. So with that, why don't I stop? I know we're running a bit late, so and I can take any questions. Questions. When does the break start? Right. So it's the most important question at this point.
Before the break, I have a question regarding to the power consuming. So in the related to exact scale, like people frequently mentioned to clock rate and also the entity of inflation. But like no, I mean just personally, I haven't seen people talk about the how to reduce the voltage also or energy consumption for chip? I mean, is there any progress in different chip manufacturers?
Yeah, so reducing voltage. And by the way, yes, you hear a lot about clock rate because you might have noticed 2005 was when we stopped raising clock rate and started going to multi-core. And that's because there's a factor of 3 in the relationship. Again, not putting up an equation, but if I were, there's a factor of 3 between power and frequency, right? So every 10% frequency is 30% more power, which is why you see things like Xeon Phi where they're trying to push clock rates down, not up, and then everybody complains and they give up for a while and push them back up again. So, but yeah, voltage scaling, we're actually down inside the chip, it's below a volt. And you know, the issue there is how low can you get it and still distinguish clearly between a 0 and a 1 on the output of a circuit, right? So I think, you know, we're at around 0.9 volts internally at this point. You know, we used to run everything at 5. So they've reduced that by like 80% over the last 15-ish years. But I haven't seen any transistors that can go below about 3/4 of a volt and still get low error rate in the output. So I'm not sure how much more we have to do. There are some circuit things you can do in reversible computing to lower leakage current. I think really the number one thing we can do that is underappreciated, well, you know, and by the way, cloud data centers eat about 3% of the US power. Collectively around the world, cloud data centers use more power than Japan. So it's a pretty substantial chunk, but software efficiency, right? You saw those curves I was showing where things are, you know, 2 orders of magnitude below where they ought to be. If we could write efficient software, we'd save more power than anything we could do in scaling devices. But no one wants to hear that because it's a very expensive problem. But yeah, I think we're pretty close to as low as I think we can go at the moment in voltage scaling. So. I can hear you. I'll just repeat the question for the people on there.
As someone who makes software that others might use, I think a lot about what's useful for others to use software. I was wondering, especially on large super clusters.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, did you have any questions on that? I've been looking into maybe containers.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sure like how much that, you know, if there are no cons to them.
Not really. So the question was, you know, thinking about if you're writing code that somebody may have to reuse it one day and how to best do that and reproduce things. And so, and there are a number of best practices around that. You know, again, clearly documenting decisions is probably the biggest one, but containers specifically, I mean, containers are a good choice right now, right? And there's a lot of, again, marketing hype and technical wizardry around it, but really it's about good software engineering management, right? It's a lightweight virtualization mechanism. It's usually the thinnest ones like Charlie Cloud are like 3 system calls, right? It's not that different than doing a chroot on your machine, but it helps you package the software environment with your code, because if you've built any code, but particularly if you want an example, download and try and build TensorFlow. That should fill the next 3 weeks of your life with pain. So, as it's managing all those dependencies, right? And libraries and containers let you carry a lot of those dependencies along with the distribution unit for your code. Docker is Docker is great for laptop development, but it requires root access, so it's sort of lousy for shared environments. But if you follow like the Singularity, now Apptainer standard, there's a sort of open container standard for the ways you write your container recipes that allow us to translate between the runtime systems. So our actual sort of recommended software engineering is Docker on your laptop to develop, and then kick out that recipe to a GitHub repository of containers, and then we can check that out in Singularity and run it on the big machines, and there's almost no performance overhead. Network sharing, when you try and run a lot of them, sharing an InfiniBand device, it's messy, but if you just run one the way you would on a socket, there's literally, it's getting hard to measure the overhead of it. So it's not like the old days of virtualization. So yeah, so I think containers are a really good idea for pushing stuff out in terms of your software distribution. So.
Thank you for the talk. So I'm from Europe and I'm using the and something that very proud of is the power consumption.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Besides the fact that it's full place, is there any reason why you have such a big difference in power usage from saying sort of
Yeah, so the AMD GPUs are the best power choice on the market now. And actually you look, sure, yeah, they have efficient cooling because it's Finland, but the power per flop, if you look, is about the same as the machine at Oak Ridge, right? Same architecture, right? I think their Lumi is 2.9 megawatts for 150 petaflops. And they're at 2.1 for 1,000 petaflops, right? I'm sorry, 21.1. So the ratio per flop is about the same. And it's the AMD GPUs, right? And part of that is they've, pushed to 7 nanometer. They have a very good chiplet strategy, and, blending different technologies to get the memory power down with the high bandwidth memory they're using. So it is just currently the best chip out there for power consumption per flop. The trade-off on that, again, is programming model, right? CUDA doesn't work. So you have to do some other GPU port or run it through HIP. If you've been using it, I've been collecting stories of where it's working and not working. So I'd love to hear what your experiences are. Maybe we can chat this afternoon. So because I finally started hearing about a couple of real codes working on those. And I want to hear about more. So because how much pain that is for users is a big input for us as to whether or not we deploy that stuff. But yeah, right now the AMD GPUs are the newest thing out there and the best technology. So they're a little ahead of NVIDIA on Intel at the moment. When Ponte Vecchio ships from Intel, it'll be interesting to see if they can stay on that curve. Yes.
This is more of a question about as opposed to a question about like
Sure.
But you know how like supercomputers use a lot of like electricity and power and a lot of the is there any like initiatives to make it more like carbon neutral? Like there's use a lot of power and a lot of
Sure. Yeah. Yes, there are, and you're going to come park under our solar panels later. So, again, there's only so much we can do around system power. But I'll show you some things this afternoon we do around how we consume it. There's a lot we can do around infrastructure power, right? Which is a little bit around the edges. And again, software efficiency is going to be the #1 key. But we do buy about 30% of our power from wind at this point. The cost delta is only 7%. So I've been trying to buy more. I don't control all that directly, but we have a few hundred kilowatts of solar input to it. We've experimented with high voltage DC distribution where we never do AC DC transforms all the way from the solar panels to the machine. We had a 10,000 core machine. We ran that way for a few years with DC batteries, DC UPS, DC, 380 volt DC into the racks, right, to change the infrastructure power. We do cold water storage. We may not have time to go out back and look at that today, but behind TACC, we have 1 million gallons of chilled water because it turns out in Texas, the power grid is stressed by air conditioners, which is exactly correlated to hot, sunny summer afternoons. So we can't reduce our chilling power because we need the cold water, but I can change when we use it. So we turn off our chillers from 2 to 7 every afternoon when the power grid's under demand, and then we run extra ones at night to chill the water back down. And I run off this 1 million gallon battery of cold we have out back. It's the same number of kilowatt hours per year, but it means we can use power in the middle of the night when there's no demand on the grid. So it reduces the need to build new power plants. We shift about 2 megawatts into the night that way. So, but yeah, there's a lot of thought about, the other thing is we try not to run machines forever, right? When your machine's 6 years old, you really need to buy a new one and turn it off because the flops per watt you're getting are so much worse than the new ones at that point. People are like, you could just keep running that. I'm like, but no, it's like, I know when we had Stampede, I think Stampede 1 was 2,000 pounds of coal per month, right, to run. And so they're like, well, just leave the old one running. No, it doesn't make sense, right? So, but yeah, that's about all we can do in that space at the moment. So we are adding hydrogen fuel cells to the data center too.
So my last question, right? It's about portability. So you have been showing the slide about CUDA, if you want to achieve the best performance. And when we start doing PW the work, on GPU 5 years ago, CUDA was basically the only option.
Right.
But then it was promised that, the true portability would be achieved with OpenMP target. But to our experience, moving to Intel GPU and AMD,
it's portably bad. Yeah.
So, and for example, for what you said with AMD, actually the successful way was to translate CUDA into heat. So that was the only way we managed to run.
which is good if you have source to every library you use. Otherwise, it's
but
painful. Yes.
It's not what was promised, so why
Yeah.
there's no enough pressure on the industry to make sure that what they say is actually what happens?
Yeah, well, part of it is, the economic pressure pushes in the opposite directions, right? Having proprietary pieces, means you can sell your stuff more and get lock-in. And so all their incentives are to not deliver on this sort of portability. The other is just the fundamental facts of life, right? OpenMP 5.0 is supposed to be the, uniform directives-based thing everywhere, but it turns out the semantics for expressing something to run well on a CPU and the semantics for expressing it on a GPU are just fundamentally different. So you can write all OpenMP code, but you have to pepper it with if-defs, right, for those different cases, for what you're doing in conditional compilation. So, ultimately it's codes moving to the new language standards. We can push it to the compilers and the vendors to say, look, make Fortran 23 work right with do concurrent loops. And then we can just start publishing, right? Your implementation of this is terrible, and push them to do better. But frankly, something designed for that chip that's got a decade in on it is always going to outperform the sort of generic standard. So we're going to have to live with maybe a little bit lower performance, and we're going to have to push the language standards forward, which is why, I said, if you want to be future-proof, use the language standards, right? And then adopt OpenACC, CUDA, HIPAAFI, one API, all these things at your own risk, sort of at the moment, because they're going to be, it's always been a dream, right? Back to Java was going to solve all of our portability problems on laptops. And then they realized that the Mac had a 1-button mouse and Windows had 2. So end of portability, right? So, yes, I mean, it's going to get better, but it's not going to be as good, right? And so that's why, that's why NVIDIA markets it the way it does with those sort of 3 pillars, right? Is if you want to go really fast, use our stuff. If you want to go okay, use the industry standard stuff. But yeah, the economic incentives are wrong.